the depths of the ocean, there are things that should not exist. Impossible sounds, unknown structures, presences no one can explain. What you are about to hear is not fiction. It is a real descent into mystery. Prepare yourself, because once it begins, there will be no turning back. The echo loop in the Marianas. There are places in the world where silence is so deep that any sound becomes a presence. And among all those remote corners, there is one that seems designed to host the incomprehensible: the Mariana Trench. More than 11,000 meters below sea level, this abyss is the deepest point on the planet. A place where light does not exist and pressure mercilessly crushes any trace of conventional life. There, where time seems suspended and matter itself behaves strangely, a phenomenon began to be recorded that not only puzzled oceanographers and acoustic experts, but also awakened a much older unease, the feeling that something down there is listening to us and repeating. It all started with a series of recordings collected by a set of hydrophones deployed by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. These devices, installed to monitor seismic activity on the ocean floor, began detecting a sound pattern that initially did not attract much attention. It was a sequence of low frequencies with a deep pulsing tone that repeated cyclically. On the surface, it could have been the song of some unknown abyssal creature or the echo of a fracture in the Earth's crust. But the regularity of the pattern was what raised the first alarm. Every 7 days, almost at the same hour, the devices captured the exact same sequence. Each pulse matched in frequency, duration, and rhythm. Even when new sensors were installed at greater depths and in nearby zones, the signal continued to be heard, with unsettling clarity. It was not a random echo, nor a coincidental phenomenon. It was a perfect loop, as if something or someone were repeating a message over and over, with the precision of a machine or the patience of an unknown intelligence. The scientists who analyzed the data quickly ruled out conventional explanations. No known species, not even fin whales whose songs can travel thousands of kilometers underwater, is capable of emitting such a consistent signal over time and with such precise structure. Simulations of possible geological causes were also discarded. No tectonic movement, no methane gas collapse, no plate shift can produce a vibration with such meticulously repeated characteristics. The most unsettling moment came when the team decided to compare the recordings with old archives, preserved from the first underwater acoustic studies in the mid-20th century. In an effort to trace the origin of the phenomenon, a team of researchers played back recordings stored on old magnetic reels. And that was when everything changed. On a tape from 1967, corresponding to a secret naval exploration near the same point of the Mariana Trench, the exact same pattern was found. The same sequence, the same sound, with a clarity as surprising as it was disturbing. That implied the loop had been playing at least for over half a century, and probably even longer. How could an acoustic signal repeat with such exactness for so long in an environment as chaotic and dynamic as the ocean floor? And why did every new attempt to intervene, study, or decode the phenomenon seem to encounter a new layer of confusion? One of the most chilling aspects of this mystery is its seemingly passive nature. The sound does not respond to external stimuli. It does not change with environmental conditions. It does not vary in the presence of submarines, exploratory robots, or human maneuvers. It simply remains there, repeating, unchanging, unshakable, like a machine executing a forgotten code or a voice trapped within the folds of the abyss. In an effort to find some symbolic or mathematical relation in the pattern, several cryptography experts collaborated with the oceanographic team. They analyzed the signal using methods similar to those employed to decode encrypted messages or intercept intelligence communications. And although they could not identify a specific content, they discovered that the pattern contains a rhythmic structure that, surprisingly, aligns with certain principles of harmonic symmetry found in classical music. That opened the door to even more unsettling theories. Are we hearing a message? Or is it some kind of call? There are records from fishing communities on islands near the Western Pacific that speak of the song from the bottom of the world, a kind of legend passed down through generations, describing a deep, repetitive sound that rises from the ocean when no one expects it. Some versions see it as a harbinger, others a warning, but all agree on one common feeling. Whoever listens to it for too long begins to dream about it, and then to search for it. One of the veteran divers on the research team recounted in a confidential interview that, during a maintenance expedition to one of the hydrophones, he believed he heard the sound through the water without headphones, which is technically impossible at that depth. He said it was as if the sea vibrated internally, as if his own body synchronized with that deep and persistent pulse. In the days that followed, he claimed to feel an uncontrollable urge to return to that specific point, as if the sound were calling him, as if, somehow, it had entered him. The most alarming part was that the pattern played once, and only once, in a point in the South Atlantic, thousands of kilometers away. The monitoring teams identified the signal for exactly 1 hour before it vanished without a trace. And of course, when compared with the Mariana Trench records, it was determined to be identical. Every frequency, every pulse, every pause. As if something had replicated the echo, as if the loop had been copied to another corner of the ocean. Since then, theories have multiplied without rest. Some suggest it is ancient technology, a remnant of an underwater civilization that vanished without a trace. Others believe it could be a signal of extraterrestrial origin using the ocean's acoustic propagation channels as a means of transmission. And there are those who propose a much darker idea, that the loop was not created by anyone, that it has no intent or origin, and that it is simply an echo of the universe itself, a primordial resonance trapped in the deepest point on Earth. Science, for now, has no answers, only records, only data accumulating without forming a solid conclusion. But what is impossible to ignore is the growing sense that we are hearing something we were never meant to, something that has been there long before we arrived, and will probably keep repeating long after we are gone. There are those who, even today, keep reviewing the recordings in search of a variation, an interruption, a sign, because if the loop ever stops, then, and only then, we will know that something else has begun. The spiral path on the sand. Almost 9,000 meters below the surface of the Pacific Ocean, in a hostile stretch where pressure crushes any trace of common technology, there exists a figure that should not be there. Instruments detected it for the first time during a routine scan. A small unmanned submersible, equipped with a high-precision sonar, was outlining the seabed when something interrupted the monotony of the abyssal plain. It was a stroke, at first blurry, which gradually revealed an unsettlingly perfect shape, a gigantic spiral drawn in the sand, with a continuous line curving over itself with geometry too precise to be attributed to chance. The discovery occurred during an international scientific expedition, whose main goal was to study seismic activity in an area considered stable, without major surprises. The finding, however, diverted all efforts. Researchers observed in real time how the spiral extended almost 700 meters, with a regular width that barely varied along its course. The precision of the curve suggested clear intentionality, as if it had been sculpted by something, or someone, with advanced geometric knowledge. When cameras were sent to capture more detailed images, unease turned into bewilderment. There were no traces of machinery, no drag marks, no obvious disturbances around. The spiral was simply there, outlined on the sand with impeccable cleanliness, with no irregularities visible on its edges. The most puzzling thing was that the sediments, upon analysis, showed no signs of recent disturbance. They seemed to have been there for a long time, compacted by the extreme pressure and calm of the environment. For weeks, the team dedicated themselves to mapping the structure in detail. The sand composing the spiral had a slightly lighter tone than the rest of the seabed, which made it stand out even under the dim artificial light of the submersibles. Upon examining samples, they discovered that this color difference was not due to a different material, but to a kind of altered sedimentation process. As if something, without displacing the grains, had ordered their microscopic arrangement to cause a change in the refraction of light, a deliberate pattern inscribed on a scale that defied any logical understanding. The first theory suggested the possibility that some type of ocean current, with little studied behavior, might have generated that drawing as part of a flow dynamic. However, computational models quickly ruled that out. No known current, under those extreme conditions, could move helically over a horizontal plane without causing chaotic disturbances. The spiral was not a byproduct of the natural movement of the sea. It was something else. The news of the finding, initially shared with enthusiasm among scientific circles, began to be surrounded by uncomfortable silence. Some team members stated in private interviews that they were asked not to disclose details to the press while the nature of the phenomenon was decided. Curiously, 2 weeks later, a second vehicle was sent to the same point to check if the figure was still there. What they found left them speechless. The spiral had changed. It was still there, yes, but its shape had expanded. The outer edges were now more open, as if the stroke had continued expanding outward. It was the same figure, only larger, and the center of the spiral had shifted a few meters, slightly, as if it had begun to rotate on itself at an imperceptible pace. That meant the figure was not static. It was alive, in a sense. Not in the biological sense, but in the way something responding to a cycle can be considered alive. No one could explain how a figure traced on sand, under pressure conditions that make almost any surface phenomenon inert, could change so orderly and without leaving evidence of movement. It was as if an unknown intelligence were working on it with infinite patience, step by step, curve by curve. Previous recordings were reviewed, trying to find some signal, some hint of activity they might have missed. But what they found was even more puzzling. In a couple of frames, almost at the end of a thermal recording, a slight temperature increase was detected right at the center of the spiral. A warm spot. Small, almost invisible, but constant. For a few minutes, the center emitted heat. It did not come from the Earth's crust. There was no volcanism in the area. It was as if the very seabed had been altered from below by something no one could see. Hypotheses began to overflow academic boundaries. Some spoke of a form of geological communication. Others, more boldly, proposed that the spiral was a kind of marker, a signal, like a footprint placed there to be found, or to indicate a specific point. But who could have created it? And more so, for what purpose? In the following weeks, new sonar scans detected the appearance of similar patterns in nearby areas. Smaller spirals, at various stages of formation, as if the main figure were generating replicas around itself. It was not an isolated structure. It was the center of something larger. The geometry of the spirals was studied by experts in fractal mathematics, who found surprising correspondences with growth patterns in certain marine organisms, such as corals or nautilus shells. But the scale was radically different. Here it was not a biological form, but an intervention in the marine landscape, executed with a precision requiring control over the environment far beyond current technology. One of the researchers, in a closed conference, proposed a theory that divided his team. He claimed the spiral was not the result of an external phenomenon, but the physical manifestation of a temporal phenomenon. A kind of anchor in time, whose visible shape would be merely a consequence of something happening on another level, in another layer of reality. He was dismissed by his colleagues, at least publicly, but the recording of his presentation circulated in specialized forums for months. The last expedition to the site was abruptly suspended after the inexplicable failure of 2 of the 3 submersibles sent. Both lost communication when approaching the center of the spiral. The recovered images showed a visual distortion at the moment of the cutoff, as if the water itself had vibrated, altering perception. Since then, returning to the exact spot has been avoided, and the spiral continues down there, expanding very slowly, as if it were still drawing something we are not yet prepared to understand. Meanwhile, in the absolute darkness of that marine plain, the stroke continues, relentless, precise, silent, like a signature that never stops being written. The river that cut through the sea. There are things one expects to see when exploring the ocean floor. Wreckage remains, strange, eyeless creatures, underwater mountain ranges rising like walls in the abyssal darkness. But no one expects to find a river, much less one that flows perfectly outlined, as if someone had carefully carved it right in the middle of the ocean. And yet, that was what sensors on a submersible captured at 1,400 meters deep in the Gulf of Mexico. A compact current, with its own margins, moving like a river inside the sea, without mixing with the surrounding water, as if it belonged to another physical plane, to a different logic. This phenomenon was documented for the first time by a group of oceanographers on an expedition that initially aimed only to study sulfur levels in marine sediments. The team had sent an autonomous vehicle equipped with high-definition cameras and sensors for salinity, temperature, and pressure. What appeared on the screens exceeded all expectations. A channel cutting through the seabed, flowing so clearly that one could distinguish its banks, the small waves on its surface, and even what seemed to be fog banks floating above it, as if it were a mountain river moving through a landscape of stone and silt in the eternal darkness of the ocean floor. At first, it was thought to be an optical illusion, some effect produced by water density or reflections from artificial lighting. But the sensors confirmed something far stranger. The liquid circulating inside the channel was not the same as the seawater. It had a higher density, an unusually high concentration of salt and minerals, and a slightly different temperature. Its movement did not respond to normal ocean currents, and the most astonishing thing was that its flow remained stable, even when encountering natural obstacles. Rocks emerging from the seabed did not interrupt its course. The river simply flowed around them, maintaining its direction as if it had an implicit will, as if it knew where it had to go. They called it the underwater river, and for years it was believed to be an isolated phenomenon, a geological accident resulting from a unique combination of factors. But soon it was discovered that its behavior had a disconcerting characteristic. The monitoring device's transmissions, every time the submersible approached it, began to show interference. The signal became erratic, data arrived incomplete, and navigation instruments suffered inexplicable deviations, as if the space around the river was distorted. In one of the strangest cases, the submersible's geopositioning system indicated for brief seconds a completely different location, an impossible coordinate, hundreds of kilometers inland, deep in the jungle. The failure was attributed to software errors, but the event could never be replicated in the laboratory. It only happened there, in the presence of the river. The most unsettling part came later, when spectral analyses of the obtained images were conducted. A series of researchers from the University of Sapporo applied filters to detect reflection patterns on the edges of the channel, seeking to better understand the chemical components of the flow. What they found was unexpected. Along the river's course, at specific points, there were zones where light bounced anomalously, as if solid surfaces were submerged within the current. Hidden objects, elongated, with regular outlines. Some were shaped like columns, others like half-buried arches. But all shared the same alignment, a geometry suggesting construction, a pattern, as if beneath the current there was a structure, or something older than the very sand over which it flowed. One of the researchers, a specialist in underwater archaeology, proposed that the river might be following the layout of an ancient submerged city, whose shapes, buried in sediment for millennia, had been awakened by the action of this dense and salty flow. Criticism was immediate, of course, because the ocean floor is full of whimsical formations, and it is common for the human mind to see familiar shapes where there are none. But in this case, the level of symmetry between the identified objects was too precise to be dismissed so easily. The story took an even darker turn when a report leaked by an anonymous source was made public. According to that document, during a covert exploration using military technology, a submarine drone equipped with ground-penetrating radar detected a cavity beneath the channel, a sort of hollow chamber, more than 20 meters long, completely sealed by a layer of rock and sediment. There was no way to access it without excavation, and the operation was abruptly suspended for reasons never explained to the civilian team. Since then, several independent expeditions have tried to return to the site, but with baffling results. On several occasions, teams reported that the channel had changed course, that its shape was no longer the same. Even on a recent expedition, conducted by a private company for documentary purposes, it was reported that the river had disappeared. The channel remained, yes, but without the flow that once ran through it. The only thing left was a dry line, figuratively speaking, as if the river had decided to leave, as if its presence had been temporary, transient, part of a phenomenon still not understood. One of the most veteran oceanographers, upon returning from his last mission, confessed in an unofficial interview that he had felt a kind of vibration, a faint humming in the submersible's hull while floating over the dry channel. He said it was not something audible, but something felt in the bones, in the teeth, as if the ocean floor emitted a memory, as if the absence of the river was, in fact, more disturbing than its presence. The question that lingers like an underground current in the minds of those who have witnessed the phenomenon does not concern the river's origin, nor even its composition. It is deeper, more insidious. Why is there a river flowing at the bottom of the ocean? What guides it? Where does it go? And what did it reveal while it was there? Because there is something profoundly unnatural in seeing a liquid current run through the seabed with such determination, without mixing with the sea, as if it were an intruder in a world that does not belong to it. Something that has more than once awakened suspicion that mechanisms operate beneath the ocean that completely escape our categories of knowledge. And if something flows through them, it does so for a reason. The river that cut through the sea exists in records, in images, in data, but also in the subsequent silence, in the way those who have seen it avoid speaking of it, as if they sense there are paths that should not be taken, and waters that, although they seem familiar, do not really belong to this world. The diver who emerged alone. There are stories told quietly among experienced divers, tales that do not appear in safety manuals or dive protocols, but that circulate in the margins of logbooks, passed from mouth to mouth like warnings disguised as anecdotes. Stories that settle in the mind like a persistent drop, like that intuition that arises just before diving into a crack that is too narrow, or when visibility begins to fade without any apparent reason. This is one of those stories. But what sets it apart from the others is that it is documented. And what is known for certain is that 2 men went down to the sea, and only one returned. The expedition took place off the coast of Cephalonia, a small island in the Ionian Sea, famous for its underwater cave system that extends like stone arteries beneath the seabed. It is a fascinating place, even beautiful, but also treacherous. The internal currents change direction without warning. Visibility can become zero in seconds, and the rocky walls seem to close in with the slightest miscalculation. Despite this, professional divers are drawn by the possibility of exploring a barely charted system, where there are still corners without names or maps. The protagonists of this story were 2 experienced divers. Marco, a technical instructor with more than 10 years of complex dives, and Elias, a marine biologist and his usual expedition partner. They had worked together on more than a dozen explorations, and their synchronization underwater was absolute. That morning, like many others, they checked their equipment, planned the route, verified oxygen levels, communications, and lights. The dive was to last about 40 minutes, with a controlled descent to just over 70 meters, where they wanted to reach a newly discovered gallery thanks to sonar images. During the first 15 minutes, everything proceeded normally. The camera mounted on Marco's helmet shows a smooth sequence: gentle descents, narrow passages, bubbles rising slowly, and the constant presence of Elias by his side, checking coral formations and taking photographs. At one point, they come across an unexpected fork. To the left, the tunnel continues as expected. To the right, a vertical, narrow crack seems to descend much deeper than planned. The decision was quick, as usually happens between those who trust each other blindly. They decided to explore the crack for a few meters before continuing along the original route. From that point, the footage becomes strange. There is no technical error. The camera keeps working. But something changes. The environment, the light, even the behavior of the water seem different. Visibility decreases despite no particles being suspended. It is as if a shadow had settled on the very stone. Both divers advance, and then something happens that no expert has managed to explain. Marco turns to the right to check his position, and when he looks forward again, Elias is no longer there. There is no whirlpool, no collapse, no evidence of a detachment. The tunnel remains intact. Elias has simply disappeared from his field of vision in less than 2 seconds. Marco keeps calm, at least he appears to, and begins to circle, looking for any sign of his partner. He ascends a few meters, turns on the auxiliary light, checks the audio signals which give no response. In the footage, his breathing can be seen speeding up, but the most disturbing thing happens right after. When Marco turns the camera for the third time, he points it at the rock wall to his left. And for a very brief moment, what is seen is not solid stone. It is a liquid surface, as if part of the rock had become a transparent membrane that ripples slightly, as if it were alive. Inside that surface, at that almost impossible to capture instant, a dark, elongated silhouette can be perceived, moving very slowly. Then everything returns to normal. The rock is there, intact. There is no evidence that anything has changed, but the footage captured it, and the silhouette was there. The emergency protocol was activated as soon as Marco emerged, visibly disturbed, still gasping with the regulator in his mouth. He did not speak. He barely stood. When he was finally able to speak, he said something that was recorded in the rescue report. The wall absorbed him. It did not touch him. It just swallowed him. Maritime authorities immediately launched a search operation. Several teams descended the same route, documenting every step, every corner. They found no trace of Elias. Neither his equipment, nor his camera, nor even the bubbles that normally get trapped in the narrowest cavities. Nothing. As if he had never been there. The area analysis revealed no cracks, strange currents, or pressure changes. Physically, the tunnel remained exactly the same. Only one person was missing. In the following weeks, Marco was interviewed by psychologists, extreme diving experts, and even by members of military units specialized in confined environments. They all agreed on one key point. His account, although extraordinary, was coherent. He showed no signs of narcosis hallucination or dissociative trauma. What he said with unshakable certainty. He had not seen his partner vanish or sink. He had seen the stone take him. It surrounded him without violence. It wrapped him like a dense, impossible curtain of water, then closed without leaving any mark. The most baffling event occurred 3 months later. During a routine cleaning of the tunnel's main chamber, the maintenance team found a fragment of fabric caught in a narrow cavity. The color and material matched exactly the suit Elias was wearing on the day of his disappearance. However, the piece showed no signs of being cut or worn, as if it had not been torn off, but formed completely within the stone, as if it had been born there, as part of it. To this day, Elias's case remains open, but within technical diving circles it has ceased to be treated as an accidental disappearance. In advanced training schools, his name is sometimes mentioned with a respect that goes beyond professionalism, as if everyone knows that what happened there was not a human error or equipment failure, but a silent reminder that the sea, especially the one hidden beneath the rock, holds forms of existence we do not understand, passages that do not follow our laws, and doors that should not be opened without knowing what lies on the other side. Because there are places where water behaves differently, where time seems to bend, and matter folds softly in invisible directions. And if one gets too close to those points, there may be no way back. As if the ocean, for moments, allowed itself to devour the known world and taste something new. Buoy 17, that disappeared. In the middle of the ocean, where the horizon is a trembling line that never quite defines itself, there are small structures floating like silent sentinels. Monitoring buoys, technological guardians that watch the weather, tides, currents, and often, though we may not know it, things we have not even begun to understand. One of these buoys, simply designated as Buoy 17, was installed by the Ocean Observation Agency at a strategic point in the North Atlantic, near the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, an area of intense geological, meteorological, and electromagnetic activity. It was a state-of-the-art buoy, equipped with atmospheric sensors, hydroacoustic devices, magnetometers, and a real-time transmission system. It was designed to withstand storms, currents, and extreme conditions for years. Its structure was reinforced, its batteries self-sufficient, and its GPS beacon emitted constant signals every 15 minutes. In theory, it was indestructible. Yet, on April 9th at 3:12 in the morning, it disappeared. The last data packet it sent was as normal as the hundreds before. There was no warning, no records of anomalies. Everything seemed in order. And then, silence. As if someone had flipped a switch. The system alarms triggered instantly, and a satellite response team tried to triangulate its last position. What they discovered did not match logic. The data indicated the buoy had vanished from the area, but not by drifting or sinking. It simply was no longer there. Search vessels were deployed, drones and aircraft were used. For days, they combed an area of more than 400 square kilometers, without finding any trace. What puzzled investigators most was that the sea in that area was unusually calm. There were no storms or swells, nothing that explained a sudden disappearance. The buoy was not dragged away. It did not sink. It did not explode. Its system did not collapse. Its signal simply ceased to exist. 3 months passed. The incident had been filed as a technical loss with undetermined cause, when the impossible happened. On July 18th, over 6,000 kilometers from its original position, in the southeastern Indian Ocean, a small Norwegian research vessel detected an unidentified signal during a routine calibration. Upon comparing frequencies, they noticed it matched a buoy registered as inactive. And when they extracted the data stored in its internal memory, the surprise was absolute. It was Buoy 17. It was intact, without signs of structural damage. Its solar panels were still functioning, and the internal sensors had continuously recorded every second since its disappearance. The buoy had not stopped operating. It had only stopped transmitting. And the most inexplicable thing was that the records showed its location as if it had never moved. According to its own sensors, it had remained exactly at the point in the Atlantic where it was originally installed the entire time. However, that was impossible, because physically, it was on the other side of the planet. The The scientists analyzing the data were caught between two incompatible truths. On one hand, the GPS marked a specific point for 3 months, without deviation. On the other, the buoy was in front of them, floating calmly in waters where it should never have arrived. The possibilities were so baffling that several team members refused to speculate publicly. Others, however, began to develop theories beyond the accepted. What if the buoy had not moved at all? What if it was the environment that changed? Or if during that time it simply was not in this physical plane? The most chilling detail emerged when analyzing the acoustic files. For 36 consecutive days, the underwater sensors recorded a constant low-frequency sound, almost imperceptible to the human ear. A hum that remained stable in intensity and pattern. When converted into a spectrogram, researchers noticed the sound traced a loop, a contained echo that repeated every 14 hours with absolute precision. Someone proposed comparing it with electromagnetic patterns, and there appeared an unexpected correlation. The hum matched the frequency of the planet's natural emissions, but inverted. The sound seemed to be a kind of negative reflection of the Earth's electromagnetic field, as if the buoy had been immersed in an area where polarity manifested in reverse. This unleashed a wave of theories, from space-time alterations to incursions in regions where physical laws change. Some consulted physicists spoke of reality bubbles, or dimensional escape points that could form in zones of intense underwater activity. Places where space-time folds, unfolds, or bends over itself. Of course, none of these explanations has been officially validated. In formal publications, the case of Buoy 17 remains an unresolved anomaly, mentioned only as a footnote. But in more discreet circles, the full file circulates as study material, cited in private talks and classified documents. What is disturbing is not so much that the buoy disappeared. What is truly unsettling is that it kept functioning as if nothing had happened while appearing to be suspended in a place that was not this world, sending data with no destination, listening to something we still do not understand. There is a passage in the journal of one of the technicians who recovered the buoy, written before he was forbidden to speak on the matter. It says, "It keeps doing the same, but there is something different. When it floats, it does not do so with the same resistance. It seems lighter, as if it were less anchored to this reality, as if it only partially floats." Subsequent tests confirm this. When it was reinstalled for calibration analysis, its sensors showed a minimal but constant variation in gravitational readings. It was not enough to be considered a fault, but enough to indicate that its interaction with Earth's gravity was no longer exactly the same as at the time of its manufacture. As if something during that time outside of time had changed the nature of its mass. And in the weeks that followed, other details began to emerge. The magnetic readings in its structure showed a subtle alteration. Some electronic components seemed to have aged faster than others. And in the internal memories, there were fragments of corrupted code, lines of data repeating in binary sequence, as if something had tried to overwrite information unsuccessfully. Today, Buoy 17 is dismantled, spread across different laboratories. Officially, no report on its case has been released to the public. But among those who work with ocean monitoring systems, its story circulates as a warning disguised as a myth, because there are objects that do not return the same. Instruments designed to capture the visible, which end up recording what they were not created for. And if an inert artifact can be altered after crossing a boundary we do not understand, what would happen to a human being? The buoy heard something that seems indisputable, something that left a mark on its systems, something the sea did not explain, and that no one seems willing to explain. And there lies the true mystery, not in the disappearance, but in what it brought back. The lantern-eyed creature. The depth of the ocean is, in many ways, the closest thing we have to a parallel universe, a place where the rules that govern the surface seem to loosen, where light vanishes after just a few hundred meters and everything we know begins to transform into something else. In that realm of crushing pressure and permanent darkness dwell life forms that seem drawn from a fevered imagination. Beings whose existence contradicts everything we thought we understood about evolution. And it was precisely in one of those forgotten abysses that a creature appeared, leaving an indelible mark on all who had access to the only existing recording. A lantern-eyed creature whose gaze not only illuminated the water, but seemed to pierce the will of whoever looked at it. The incident occurred during an underwater mapping expedition organized by an international consortium in a still little explored area of the Indian Ocean, at more than 3,600 meters deep. The goal was to map a series of active tectonic faults and take samples of the seabed. For this, a remotely operated vehicle was used, equipped with high-sensitivity cameras and spotlights capable of piercing the darkness over long distances. During the first days, everything went normally. Geological formations, thermal activity, bioluminescent species typical of the environment. Until, in the middle of a live broadcast, something unexpected crossed the camera's field of view. The first thing that caught attention was a sudden alteration in the light. A brief, sharp white flash emerged from the right side of the frame. The operator thought it was a reflection, perhaps an optical artifact caused by particle bounce. However, when adjusting the viewing angle, the camera captured something completely unusual. An elongated figure moving through the water with smooth and silent motions, whose face emitted a constant light from two symmetrical points, as if its eyes were actual lanterns. The creature remained in front of the lens for only 46 seconds. But that time was enough for everything to change. Its body, which seemed composed of a translucent membrane and internal veins, floated with a calm that defied the laws of physics under such pressure. It did not move like a fish or a cephalopod. Its movement did not come from fins, but from a kind of internal flow, as if its form were propelled by a hidden current inside. The most disturbing, however, were its eyes. Two perfect spheres, incandescent, which did not reflect external light but generated it from within, with an intensity that did not diffuse in the water, as if the darkness itself recoiled before their presence. The strangeness did not end there. As the creature floated in front of the camera, its eyes seemed to fix on the lens. Not by accident, not casually, but with a palpable intention. Those who saw the live transmission claimed to feel something hard to describe, a psychological pressure, a kind of visceral discomfort, as if they were being watched from inside the water. As if somehow, what was looking at them could also see beyond the physical. As if the connection was not between machine and animal, but between consciousness and consciousness. The technicians, surprised, tried to increase the resolution of the main spotlight, but just as they adjusted the controls, the signal was completely interrupted. The vehicle was inoperable for 4 hours. When it reconnected, the environment was empty. There were no traces of the creature. But the recording had been saved on the system's internal drives. For weeks, it was analyzed by marine biologists, optics experts, imaging engineers, and even neuroscientists. No one could precisely explain what was seen there. Some proposed it was an uncatalogued species adapted to extreme environments. Others considered the possibility of a hoax, but all technical analyses confirmed the footage was authentic, unaltered, and that the sensors had recorded the levels of light emission as real. The most unsettling part of the analysis was discovering that the frequency of the light emitted by the creature's eyes partially matched certain patterns of human brain stimulation. It was a low frequency, similar to brainwaves associated with deep dreaming states. Some researchers theorized that, if true, the creature was not simply illuminating but emitting a type of stimulus capable of affecting those who observed it for prolonged periods. Although this hypothesis was officially dismissed, several mission operators reported curious symptoms in the days after the event. Insomnia, nightmares with underwater environments, a feeling of being watched even outside of work. The recording was archived under the technical name Unclassified Optical Incident 6L, and for a brief period was part of closed presentations at extreme biology conferences. Then it disappeared. Not figuratively. It literally ceased to exist on the servers. The original copy was withdrawn by orders from one of the project's funding agencies, and backup copies had encoding errors making them unusable. Only a few fragments were recovered thanks to screenshots taken during initial presentations. And although they have no motion or sufficient resolution for a full analysis, they clearly show the eyes lit in the darkness, floating in the middle of the abyss. Since then, at least 3 similar sightings have been reported in different parts of the world. One in the trenches off Papua New Guinea, another in an underwater canyon in the Caribbean Sea, and a third on the eastern Pacific Ridge. In all cases, the reports share a common structure: a translucent figure moving with motions foreign to known hydrodynamics, and eyes that emit their own light without generating detectable heat. Some independent researchers have begun formulating a bold theory. They argue that we are not facing a conventional biological creature, but a form of life that operates under completely different principles. An organism capable of generating luminous energy from an internal system still unknown, and perhaps endowed with forms of perception that exceed our current understanding. A type of intelligence that does not manifest through gestures or language, but through presence, through gaze. An intelligence that hides not on the surface of the observable, but in zones science has yet to fully illuminate. Some have even proposed an even more unsettling idea: that these creatures did not evolve here, that they came from some other environment, and that the seabed is not their original habitat, but their refuge, a place where they can live without interference, hidden beneath pressure and darkness, far from civilizations not yet ready to see them. And if that hypothesis is true, if we really are sharing the planet with entities that prefer to stay aside, then every encounter with them is not an accident. It is a warning, a crack in normality through which something much older and deeper slips in. The lantern-eyed creature remains a silent presence in the memory of those who saw it. And even though the official files have disappeared, even though the reports have been silenced, there is one detail that remains. A feeling hard to erase. The certainty of having been watched from a darkness we do not understand. A gaze that was not animal, nor human. A gaze that seemed to know too much. The storm that whispered names. During the first weeks of September, when the Atlantic hurricane season reaches its most intense point, atmospheric monitoring systems activate with almost surgical precision. Dozens of satellites and floating stations record in detail every pressure variation, every slight cloud formation, every convective core that could become a cyclone. It is a perfectly choreographed ballet of science and prevention, where everything seems measured, predictable within chaos. But that balance was broken one dawn, when an anomaly appeared that defied the logic of nature. A storm without movement. A vast mass of black clouds that neither advanced nor spun, simply remaining suspended over the same spot in the ocean for more than 4 days, as if refusing to obey the laws of the wind. And what emerged from its interior was something no radar was prepared to interpret. A voice, or many voices, murmurs, and among them names. The first reports came from the Bermuda weather station. The operator in charge of the night transmissions detected interference in the radio frequency band used to monitor cyclones in formation. At first, he thought it was white noise, a common distortion caused by humidity in the air. But after listening carefully to the repeated pattern, he noticed a series of unusual peaks in the low frequencies, as if there were modulation with intention. He decided to record it and apply an isolation filter, and that was when the first recognizable word appeared. A slightly distorted voice, as if carried by the wind, whispering something like, "Lena." It was not a clear signal, nor was it accompanied by any artificial tone indicating human interference. It was an atmospheric sound, trapped between frequencies, coming directly from the heart of the storm. Over the following hours, by applying various sound decoding algorithms, the operator began extracting more names. All whispered with a strangely constant cadence, in different tones, by distinct voices. Some were male, others female. All human. None repeated. The news soon reached other weather stations. An analysis network was formed including acoustics experts, linguists, telecommunications engineers, and even military personnel specialized in signal capture. The most baffling part was that the phenomenon did not seem to respond to any terrestrial or satellite transmission. The sounds did not come from any device. They were embedded within the same electromagnetic spectrum generated by the storm's electrical activity, as if the lightning and winds were functioning as a transport medium for a voice that no one had emitted. Researchers cross-referenced the data with historical meteorological archives, searching for any similar anomaly. They found only one partially documented case in 1968, when a small meteorological ship reported voices in the wind before disappearing without a trace near the Azores. At that time, recording technology was rudimentary, and the report was considered an exaggeration caused by stress. But now, with state-of-the-art equipment capturing the phenomenon from multiple points, the mystery became impossible to ignore. A linguist from the University of Lisbon managed to isolate 117 different names. Many had no immediate correlation. They were common names from various languages and origins. But there was one that marked a before and after in the investigation. Among the list appeared the name of a woman who had disappeared in the Atlantic exactly 11 years earlier. Her boat, a private sailboat, had lost contact in the very area where the motionless storm now hovered. It was never found. Her name, Adelina Ribeiro, appeared 3 times in the recording, pronounced by a male voice with a Portuguese accent. The file underwent deep phonetic analysis, and to everyone's surprise, it matched an old voice recording of the missing woman's husband, who had died years before. The comparison revealed a 98% match. This raised an unbearable question. How could a storm contain the voice of someone dead? The names kept emerging. In some cases, they were traceable. They matched people reported missing at sea over the last decades: sailors, divers, tourists, fishermen. In others, no record existed. They were names without apparent past or history, just sounds floating in the heart of a storm that refused to move. Some researchers began speculating that the phenomenon might be related to the acoustic properties of certain climatic formations, that the specific combination of pressure, humidity, and temperature could generate sounds interpretable by the human mind as names, a sort of auditory pareidolia. But this theory crumbled when names were detected in languages the analysts did not even recognize. Extinct languages, archaic dialects, even phonetic structures that did not belong to any known human language, yet followed clear phonological logic, as if fragments of a language beyond our reach. The most orthodox meteorologists insisted it was coincidence, that in a universe of possible combinations, it was inevitable that some noise formations resembled words. But those who heard the raw recordings knew it was not casual. The voices had inflection, rhythm, intonation. There was intention behind each name pronounced, as if someone were reading a list, or calling, one by one, those who had fallen into the depths. In a confidential meeting among maritime security agencies, a more radical hypothesis was proposed, that the storm functioned as a kind of memory node, a point in space where atmospheric, electromagnetic, and temporal layers overlapped anomalously, allowing fragments of information, perhaps even consciousness, to become trapped as persistent echoes. A kind of meteorological vinyl record, spinning on itself, repeating again and again the names of those who, at some point, crossed its threshold. In the following days, a reconnaissance plane flying over the storm area reported a sudden failure in all its communication systems. The radios emitted static for exactly 13 minutes. Upon signal recovery, the internal recorders contained an unprogrammed file, a sequence of names, all different from those detected until then, and at the end, a sound that none of the experts could classify. A buzzing that rose until it became unbearable, then cut off abruptly, as if something on the other side had hung up the phone. The storm disappeared as mysteriously as it had arrived. It did not dissipate or disintegrate. It simply ceased to exist. The satellites tracking it lost sight within 3 minutes. In its place, absolute calm covered the sea. The wind stopped. The clouds evaporated, and the sea became flat as a mirror, without movement or sound. For nearly an hour, it was as if nothing existed there, as if the ocean had taken a pause. No one knows for certain what that storm was, nor why it contained names, nor how it is possible that it repeated voices that should no longer exist. What remains are the recordings, the files cross-referenced with disappearance records, and the echo of something that still resonates in the deepest frequencies of the sea. Because if there is one thing the ocean seems to guard with stubborn devotion, it is not only its physical secrets, its impossible creatures, or its geological anomalies. It is memory. A memory that sometimes manifests in forms barely touched by reason. And when it does, it whispers, as if it wants to be heard without being understood, as if it still remembered the names of all those who sank into its silence. The Growing Monolith. Deep in the Pacific Ocean, far below the band where the sun's rays dissolve into liquid twilight, there is an underwater plateau that for years was considered one of the most stable and predictable zones of the seabed. A flat terrain without volcanic activity, cracks, or detectable shifts. The perfect place to install a long-term oceanic observatory. That is how, in the year 2011, a group of Japanese and American researchers selected this spot to place a network of seismic sensors, autonomous environmental monitoring cameras, and buoys anchored by titanium cables. Nothing seemed to indicate that there, amid that landscape of inert stone, a structure would appear that would challenge the most basic notions about the passage of time, the nature of matter, and the relationship between the organic and the artificial. The first image of the monolith was recorded almost by accident. One of the cameras, programmed to take a general panoramic shot every 24 hours, captured a vertical figure that was not present in previous sequences. It measured approximately 3 meters, had a rectangular shape, and rose with clean angles above the rocky surface. The most striking feature was its texture. It appeared to be made of a single piece, without cracks, without visible joints, and reflected artificial light with an anomalous intensity for such an opaque environment. In subsequent images, it was observed that the figure not only remained in place, but also cast a longer shadow with each capture, as if the angle of incidence had changed. But the spotlights were fixed, anchored with millimetric precision. The only possible conclusion was also the most improbable. The structure had grown. The researchers, incredulous, ordered a direct inspection. A remotely operated vehicle descended to the site, circled the object, and transmitted live images. The monolith was even more unsettling up close. It had no markings, inscriptions, or surface wear. Its base seemed fused with the stone, as if it had sprouted from it. And when its surface was touched with the mechanical arm of the submersible, the sensors recorded a slight vibration, a barely perceptible frequency that did not correspond to any usual thermal or sound emission. Measurements were repeated over weeks, and the result was consistent. The monolith was growing, at a tiny, almost imperceptible rate of about 2 millimeters per week, but continuously, precisely, without deviations or deformations. The most puzzling thing was that its mass did not increase in proportion to its volume. According to the recorded data, it seemed to expand without gaining weight, as if it were a phenomenon of molecular reorganization, rather than growth by accumulation. Theories began to emerge. Some pointed to an unknown mineral process, a prolonged crystallization that escaped known geological models. Others suggested the presence of life, a form of non-biological existence that could alter its shape at will. But no hypothesis could explain the simplest fact. The object was not there one day, and the next, it was. Weeks turned into months, and with them, the monolith continued growing. By mid-next year, it already measured almost 5 meters. Its surface, however, had begun to change. On its north face, a series of barely visible grooves formed like carved lines that did not seem the result of erosion or external impacts. The researchers applied three-dimensional scanners to map the new marks, and when they digitally reconstructed them, they discovered a pattern that matched a fractal sequence known as the Mandelbrot set, a self-replicating mathematical structure found in natural phenomena such as the distribution of galaxies or the shape of certain organisms. That coincidence pushed part of the team to consider a disturbing possibility. The monolith was not an isolated structure. It was a self-regulated entity, capable of shaping itself according to an internal logic that responded to universal mathematical principles, a form of intelligence embedded in matter. The question, however, was as immense as it was impenetrable. What was it trying to say? Thermal images showed no heat whatsoever. The monolith remained cold, static, inert in appearance. But beneath that material silence, electromagnetic measurements began to show fluctuations. In a specific band of the spectrum, the structure emitted pulses that, after analysis, revealed a rhythmic sequence of 11 intervals. Each interval lasted exactly 126 seconds, and then the pattern repeated. It was like a looping signal, without an apparent message, without traditional encoding, but constant. It was recorded for 87 consecutive days. Then, it ceased without reason, and for 3 weeks, the monolith remained in total silence. At the end of that period, it suddenly grew 8 centimeters, breaking its own growth rhythm for the first time since its discovery. That jump in growth triggered all alarms. The scientific authorities involved decided to restrict access to the area and classify part of the collected material. The team was reduced, and live transmissions were suspended. What followed was a much more opaque phase of investigation, where data was leaked, versions were contradictory, and technicians avoided answering any questions clearly. An unofficial report, leaked through an encrypted document, claimed that during a nighttime dive, conducted in complete radio silence, one of the submersibles captured an image that still divides opinions today. A few meters from the monolith, on its east face, a humanoid figure partially integrated into the surface appeared. It did not move. It had no defined features, but it seemed fused with the structure, like a sculpture emerging from the matter, trapped at an intermediate point between form and intention. The next day, the figure had disappeared, and the recorded material, according to multiple sources, was deleted from the servers by direct order of the program's leaders. Since then, the monolith continues growing, slowly but without stopping. From time to time, its surface changes. New lines appear, new textures, zones of artificial wear that cannot be the product of the environment. It behaves like a living object that does not depend on nutrients, like a presence that reconfigures its skin according to parameters beyond our understanding. It is now over 7 meters tall, and the space it occupies has begun to alter the magnetic distribution of the nearest sensors. It has become a stable anomaly, a fixed point that alters its surroundings without anyone being able to stop it. Some believe the monolith is a machine. Others, that it is a message. Some think it is a kind of cosmic seed, planted on the seabed to fulfill a cycle that is just beginning. But beyond conjectures, there is a disturbing certainty that everyone involved silently acknowledges. We are witnessing something not created by our hands, something that does not respond to our measuring tools, and that advances, without hurry, without pause, toward a form that perhaps we are not yet ready to see. Because there are structures that grow without being organic, forms that do not adapt to the environment, but shape it. And when they emerge from the deepest sea, in absolute silence, their presence does not announce a threat or a promise, but something more disturbing. The certainty that we are not the only designers of this world. The net that burned underwater. There are stories that seem to have been taken from a poorly remembered fable. Events so improbable, so contrary to what basic physics dictates, that when hearing them, one tends to smile in disbelief. But when the words come from those who have lived their entire lives at sea, when the eyes of the narrator do not shift even a fraction while reconstructing the event in absolute detail, then the story settles into a more uncomfortable place. And something in the body, deep within instinct, recognizes that it might have happened. Thus begins the case of the net that burned underwater, an incident not found in any science book, but etched into the collective memory of a small fishing village in northern Iceland, where the sea is everything and explanations are scarce. The vessel was called Gunnar Hjaltason, a medium-sized boat dedicated to bottom fishing, specializing in catching demersal fish, those that live near the seabed, where light does not reach and pressure turns every maneuver into a challenge. On the day of the incident, the sea was calm, the sky covered by clouds of a uniform gray that filtered a muted light. The captain, Jon Eriksson, a man with over 20 years of experience in deep waters, had charted a routine route to a traditional fishing spot known by the nickname the Mute Throat. That place, despite its unsettling name, had always been productive and had never given reasons to distrust its silence. The net was deployed at 7:43 in the morning. A structure more than 120 meters long, reinforced with lead and stainless steel, slowly descended until it touched the seabed at more than 600 meters deep. The entire process was accompanied by automated sensors recording cable tension, water resistance, and temperature in the area. Nothing indicated any anomaly. But just 20 minutes after the net touched bottom, problems began. First, there was a sudden jerk. The tension increased unexpectedly, as if something gigantic had become trapped or decided to resist. Then, a constant vibration started ascending the cable, a kind of metallic buzzing that reached the deck of the boat. They thought it might be a damaged cable or even a large animal. But then one of the crew shouted. From the water, right where the cable entered the sea, a column of bluish bubbles rose, as if something were boiling beneath the surface. The bubbles were not warm to the touch, but their emission was rhythmic, as if coming from a source unresponsive to the environment. That was when the net began to burn. The scene is hard to imagine, even with the testimonies in hand. Through the depth monitor, they saw a light beginning to travel up the cable from below, rising slowly. It was an incandescence of electric blue color, similar to that produced by a plasma discharge, but sustained. At first, they thought it was a camera malfunction, but seconds later, that light passed through the water and appeared on the surface. The cable glowed, literally glowed. And when they lifted the net a few meters, they could see that part of it was wrapped in what seemed like combustion without oxygen. Blue flames, without smoke, without apparent heat, clung to the structure like a liquid tongue of energy. The crew tried to cut the net to prevent it from reaching the deck, but the heat suddenly increased. It did not come from the fire, but from the metal itself. The winding system collapsed, and a sharp screech began to flood the boat. The captain, fearing an explosion, ordered all the gear to be released. The net sank again, dragging much of the wiring with it. The flames did not disappear immediately. They remained visible for a few more seconds below the surface before fading as if they had never existed. During the following hours, the crew remained silent. No one knew what to say. They reviewed thermal records, tension sensors, oxygen levels. No data seemed to correspond with what they had just witnessed. Temperatures did not exceed 20 degrees Celsius. The chemical content of the water was normal. No flammable component was detected, but the net had burned, and everyone had seen it. When they finally decided to return, they reported the event to maritime authorities. Technicians were sent to the port to examine the remains of the cable, which had partially melted at its upper end. What they found was even stranger. The melting had not occurred due to heat. There were no traces of carbon or deformations typical of a flame. Instead, the steel fibers were restructured, as if reorganized from within. A kind of atomic metamorphosis, inexplicable by any known phenomenon. An independent laboratory in Reykjavik analyzed the composition of the residues adhered to the net. They expected to find organic compounds, perhaps bioluminescent. But the results showed an amorphous substance composed of silicon, boron, and traces of an element yet unclassified, with a crystalline structure that does not correspond to any terrestrial mineral. The most conservative theory suggested interaction with an unknown geothermal source, but that did not explain the molecular reorganization nor the absence of detectable thermal energy. When questioned, the fishermen offered no theories. They limited themselves to describing what they saw. One of them, without any intent to dramatize, said it with a simplicity that chilled the investigators. It was not fire. It was something else, as if the sea had grown tired of being touched. Since then, the mute throat remains unused. No one dares to cast nets in that area. Nautical charts mark it as a zone of electromagnetic risk, although no activity has been recorded since that day. The incident has been shared at oceanographic conferences under the technical name of anomalously cold combustion event in a hyperbaric environment, an elegant phrase that fails to capture the gravity of what happened. There are those who believe the net touched something that should not be touched, that it grazed a living structure, or perhaps a submerged technology, latent for centuries. Others, more esoteric, think of entities that inhabit the abyssal zones, beings that need no form or language to warn us that we have crossed a boundary. And some simply keep silent, as those who have seen something they cannot explain, but know was real. Because there are moments when the sea answers, and when it does so with symbols we cannot decipher. A light that does not burn, a flame that does not consume, a net that transforms into a message that does not seek to be understood, only remembered. Like a secret spoken only once, underwater, among echoes that no one else hears. The shape that returned the gaze. There are moments when the silence of the seabed takes on a new density, as if it were watching. It is not a constant sensation, nor something measurable by instruments, but those who have spent enough hours beneath the surface know there are places where the water seems to hold a veiled consciousness, a stillness charged with attention. The story of the shape that returned the gaze is born precisely from that ambiguous perception. A figure that did not speak, did not move, did not cause physical disturbances nor alter instruments, but made everyone who saw it feel the same thing, that they were being watched from a place they did not understand. The expedition set off from Norway toward a little charted region of the Greenland Sea, where a series of underwater rocky columns, similar to a submerged basalt forest, had become the subject of study for geologists and biologists alike. The interest was genuinely scientific, to understand how those vertical formations could sustain microhabitats at such depths, where pressure can collapse metal structures if not designed with absolute precision. The group, made up of technical divers, remote vehicle operators, and oceanographers, had worked for weeks without recording anything unusual. The environment was hostile, but stable. Data flowed, and explorations were carried out with almost routine efficiency. It was during the 27th dive when everything changed. Two divers, Lars and Victor, descended with the objective of installing a fixed camera between two of the tallest columns, a task simple in appearance. The water was particularly clear that day, an unusual detail in a region prone to underwater turbulence. Visibility, according to instruments, exceeded 25 meters. When they reached 12 meters above the seabed, they began to notice something strange on the farthest column. A different shape, attached to one of the basalt walls, which had not appeared in previous days' images. At first glance, it looked like a fold of rock. Another geological accident among many. But as they got closer, what initially seemed to be mineral texture began to take defined contours. There was no movement, no glimmers, colors, or striking shadows. But the figure was clear. Too clear. An elongated silhouette, barely distinguished from its surroundings, that seemed to replicate the form of whoever was observing it. A humanoid-looking figure, motionless, fused with the environment, emitting no energy or altering the surrounding temperature. However, the most puzzling thing was that the shape, although static, was perceived as attentive. There were no visible eyes, no face. But the feeling was unmistakable. It was watching. Lars, who carried the main camera, aimed the lens directly at the figure. What he captured left the surface team speechless. On the screen, the figure was not a simple outline. Its surface clearly reflected the image of the divers, but not directly, not like a mirror, but as a slightly delayed reproduction. Instead of following movements in real time, the figure replicated what the divers did a few seconds later, as if it were imitating, as if it tried to memorize each gesture before returning it with deliberate calm. The team thought it was a technical failure, that perhaps the camera had a delay, or that the transmission system was out of sync. But upon reviewing the recordings, they confirmed the images were in sync. The delay was not from the equipment. It was from the figure. It reflected, but not immediately. It imitated. What followed was a chain of decisions made between amazement and bewilderment. The divers decided to move in sequence, slowly separate, wave their hands, change positions. The figure responded to every gesture with a slight delay, always maintaining the same visual distance. It never moved physically, but its surface seemed to adapt, copy, repeat. When Lars turned on his auxiliary flashlight, the figure returned a flash. Not a real one, measurable by sensors. A visual flash that only appeared on the recordings, as if it knew it was being filmed. The divers ascended slowly, without disturbing the environment, convinced that whatever it was more interested in observing than interacting. That night they reviewed the videos dozens of times, and each time they did, they discovered something new. In certain segments, the figure's reflection did not replicate what had happened seconds before. It reproduced movements that had not yet occurred, sequences that unfolded 1 or 2 seconds later in the actual footage. It was as if, at times, the figure anticipated what was going to happen, as if time in front of it did not follow the same course. They decided to return to the place the next day. But the figure was gone. The column was empty. No electromagnetic anomaly, no change in water density, no visible trace that anything had been there. Only the footage. Only the images. The recordings were sent to multiple laboratories. Some theories spoke of an optical illusion caused by the refraction angle in a zone of high salinity. Others proposed the existence of a biological film adhered to the rock, capable of reacting to external stimuli. But no one managed to explain the delayed replica, nor, much less, the anticipation of movements. A neuroscientist specialized in visual perception, after studying the clips for weeks, proposed a riskier idea, that the figure was not so much an object as a phenomenon, a point of intersection between perception and environment. A reactive field that used the visual signals of those who observed it to structure its form. A kind of reactive observational structure, an echo of consciousness, formed only when it was seen, when it was given attention. He called it reactive observational structure, though he admitted having no way to prove it. It was a theory that vanished the moment one tried to measure it. The divers never returned to the place, not out of fear, nor prohibition. It was a silent, shared, almost instinctive decision, as if they had understood that this was not a discovery, but a boundary. That what they found was not there to be investigated, but to prove a presence, a conscious reflection, something that did not live but existed, something that only manifested when someone looked at it, and that, in return, returned the gaze. Because there are shapes that do not belong to this world, but adopt its language. Figures that do not need to move to make us feel observed. And when the sea envelops them, when they emerge between stone and shadow, they do not appear to communicate or to attack. They only appear so that we know they are there, waiting, studying, reflecting, like an ancient and deep mirror, the part of us we still do not understand. The beating object. More than 700 meters deep, in a forgotten corner of the Adriatic Sea, an object was found whose existence defies the most basic categories of scientific logic. A spherical body, perfectly symmetrical, with an opaque surface and metallic texture, partially buried among sedimentary rock formations. What at first seemed like a fragment of some ancient shipwreck, perhaps a military buoy, a lost capsule, a mundane remnant of human activity under the sea, soon revealed a peculiarity that unleashed a chain of investigations as intense as they were discreet. That object, against all physical possibility, had a pulse. The expedition responsible for the discovery belonged to a joint project between Italian and Croatian oceanographic institutes. The official goal was to map natural cavities along the Dalmatian coast to monitor underwater seismic activity. During one of many routine explorations, one of the remote vehicles detected a magnetic anomaly, a slight but constant alteration in the local field. As they approached to investigate, the camera recorded the figure. A black sphere approximately 80 centimeters in diameter, half buried in a depression among rocks, without any markings, serial numbers, corrosion, or evidence of human manufacture. Curiosity turned into bewilderment when one of the operators noticed a rhythmic pattern in the vibrations recorded by the submersible's sensors. A very soft tapping, imperceptible to the naked eye, affecting the surrounding water with a cadence identical to that of a resting human heart. 68 beats per minute. The pattern did not respond to marine currents or geological phenomena. It came from inside the object, as if it were alive. For more than 2 hours, the team silently observed how that inert body seemed to beat, with the stubborn constancy of a conscious organism. The first hypotheses leaned toward some unknown form of internal energy, perhaps an ancient battery or a residual source of a hidden electromagnetic system. But when analyzing the surface composition through remote spectroscopy, another detail emerged that deepened the mystery. The material of which the object was made did not match any compound in the European Scientific Consortium database. It was not steel, titanium, or any type of industrial polymer. It was an unknown alloy, with particular reflective properties and such low thermal conductivity that the object seemed to absorb heat without raising its temperature. That was when they decided to extract it. The maneuver required the use of a specialized robotic arm, designed to handle delicate artifacts at great depths. During extraction, the object offered no resistance. It was lifted gently, as if it knew it was about to be removed. But as the ascent began, the first inexplicable event occurred. The beating pattern started to accelerate. From 68 it went to 75, then to 83. And before reaching 120 meters in depth, it was beating at 105 beats per minute. A rate that, in a human, would indicate a state of alert or stress. Upon reaching the surface, the object was placed in a pressurized capsule to prevent any difference in ambient pressure from altering its properties. It emitted no light, heat, or perceptible electromagnetic signal, but its pulse remained, constant, as if marking the time of a being that breathes without oxygen, that exists without needing movement. They placed it in a thermally isolated laboratory and began surface analysis tests, trying to drill, scan, or open its outer layer. They failed. Cutting tools slipped off as if made of rubber. X-rays bounced back without penetrating beyond a few millimeters. Ultrasound returned a distorted image, as if something inside the object prevented it from being observed. As days passed, the pulse changed. Not in speed, but in intensity. It increased during the night and decreased in the morning. The pattern seemed synchronized with the human cycles of the laboratory staff, even when they were not physically present in the room. Some suggested the object responded to the circadian rhythm of those observing it. Others, more skeptical, proposed coincidence or misinterpretation. But those who spent time alone in the room knew it was not a simple mistake. There was something in the way the pulse adjusted, as if the object perceived the presence of other bodies, as if it reacted to emotions or tension in the environment. One researcher, Dr. Lucia Manzoni, decided to conduct an unauthorized experiment. For several nights, she stayed beside the object for extended periods, recording her own vital signs in parallel with the artifact's beating. After a week, she found something that chilled the blood of those who read her report. Every time her heart rate increased due to stress or anxiety, the object responded by replicating exactly the same rhythm. It did not imitate a generic pattern, but duplicated hers, as if connecting with her. The most unsettling thing was that after several days of this exercise, her pulse began to regulate itself. The object seemed to calm her, as if it took control of her heart through some type of resonance. The investigation was halted by decision of the Central Project Authority, which feared for the health of those involved. The object was transferred to a military facility on the southern coast of Italy, where, according to unconfirmed sources, it underwent more invasive testing. It is said that one night, without warning, the pulse stopped. It simply ceased. But the next day, sensors recorded a second beating, different from the first, deeper, slower, as if the object had transformed internally, as if something had awakened. Since then, no one has seen the artifact. Official recordings are classified and the researchers who participated in the project were relocated. Some say the object was sent to an underground base. Others believe it still remains at the bottom of the sea, where it was returned by the decision of those who studied it, as if they understood that bringing it to the surface was a mistake. What remains is the feeling of having touched something that does not belong to our rules. A piece that beats without a circulatory system, that pulses without apparent purpose, that responds without being alive. A metallic heart at the bottom of the ocean, a mechanism that does not seek to activate, but to wait. Because there are things that beat not because they are alive, but because they are about to awaken. And when they do, perhaps we will discover that it was not our pulse they marked, but theirs. And that we, all along, were the ones responding. The island that did not exist. For centuries, maps have been tools of precision, silent witnesses of discoveries, errors and corrections that shape the way we understand the world. But sometimes, amidst all that cartographic order, anomalies slip through. Islands appearing where there is no land, mountain ranges rising and then sinking, coordinates firmly marked for generations that one day reveal themselves as ghosts. The story of the island that did not exist began precisely like that, with a patch of solid land drawn between ocean currents, at a point in the South Pacific where there should be nothing, yet many claim to have been there. The earliest records mentioning this island appear in navigation documents dated between the 17th and 18th centuries. French, British, and Portuguese sailors noted its presence east of New Caledonia, describing it as an elongated formation with low cliffs and abundant vegetation. Some accounts included sightings of coastal birds, brief landings to collect fresh water, and even the presence of rudimentary stone structures. Remarkably, the descriptions, although scattered across time and language, matched with notable accuracy. Maps began to include it under different names: Sandy Island, Île Blanche, La Silencieuse. And for more than a century, no one questioned it. Time passed, maps evolved, and navigation became a science. Satellites, aerial photography, sonar, and topographic scans refined the way we know the world. And it was then, in the year 2012, when a group of Australian scientists decided to verify with precision the dimensions of that island, recorded for so long, whose existence had been questioned after failing to appear in certain recent satellite images. Equipped with the most advanced location technology, they set sail aboard the research vessel Southern Surveyor, intending to map the area and update oceanic records. What they found was, in one word, impossible. At the exact coordinates where the island should have been, there was only open sea. No trace of land, no submerged structures, not even variations in the seabed depth. The ocean floor stretched flat and continuous down to more than 1,400 meters. It was as if nothing had ever existed there. But when analyzing the terrain with sonar, they found a second anomaly. A region of water with different thermal behavior, a kind of oceanic raft that, despite showing no relief, reflected a thermal signature that did not match the surroundings. It was as if the sea there remembered that it had once contained land. What was puzzling was that, after publishing the results, testimonies began arriving from sailors who swore they had set foot on that island. Ship captains claimed to have anchored in front of solid shorelines. Fishermen described resting under its trees. And even a couple of explorers asserted having old photographic records, taken with analog cameras, showing recognizable beaches and rock formations. The photos, although blurry, were analyzed by experts. And the most unsettling fact was that, while showing generic natural elements, the horizon and formations matched what one would expect to see from that point on the map, as if they had indeed been taken there, from an island that no longer existed. There was even one particularly disturbing case. A Polynesian sailor named Tama Heheaitu presented, as proof of his passage through the island in 1994, a small volcanic stone engraved with patterns that, according to him, he collected near a coastal crack. The rock was studied by geologists at the University of Auckland, who confirmed that its composition corresponded to a type of basalt not found on any nearby islands or the adjacent ocean floor. Its origin could not be determined, as if it had come from terrain that no longer exists. From there, theories began to multiply. Some specialists proposed that the island did exist but sank abruptly due to tectonic collapse or karst dissolution, a rare but possible phenomenon in coral or porous stone structures. However, that did not explain why no remains were found. A geological disappearance of that kind should have left clear evidence: elevations, underwater ruins, debris accumulations. But the sonar revealed a smooth seabed, without interruptions, cracks, or signs of recent sinking. Other scholars went further and spoke of shared historical errors, a collective case of cartographic duplication, where a mistaken sighting was replicated over time until it became real on paper. But then, how to explain the modern testimonies, the photographs, the volcanic stone, and that persistent thermal difference in the waters? A small group of researchers, less interested in orthodoxy and more inclined toward the phenomenological, began considering a radical possibility: that the island had not sunk, but shifted. That it still existed, but on another plane. That its presence was intermittent, appearing only under certain physical or perceptual conditions that we do not yet understand. A kind of temporal superposition phenomenon, where for brief moments the territory manifested in our world before retreating to another state. The most unsettling event was one recorded in 2016, when a Japanese cargo ship reported losing contact for exactly 14 minutes while crossing the same sector. During that lapse, navigation instruments failed, GPS coordinates fluctuated violently, and communications were impossible. The ship's captain, in his report, claimed to have seen solid land on the horizon, which disappeared as quickly as it appeared, leaving no trail or shadow. Everything returned to normal shortly after, as if nothing had happened. But satellite records during those exact 14 minutes show the region as blurry, as if something had interfered with the digital image. The island that did not exist still appears on some old maps, like a ghostly blot among coordinate lines. And in the minds of those who claim to have been there, it is not an illusion. They have memories, smells, sounds of wind through the trees. Descriptions that coincide even though they have never met each other. Those accounts carry a weight that cannot be erased by technology or official reports. Because there are places that do not respond to cartography, but to the moment when they are looked at. Spaces that resist being fixed, existing like the reflection of a shadow that moves when no one is watching. And if the island was ever there, perhaps it still is. Perhaps it has not gone away. Perhaps it is waiting to be seen again by those who know how to look at the right moment. Because some places do not disappear, they simply hide in the folds of the world, on that blurry edge where geography ceases to be certainty and begins to brush against mystery. The black sand that shone. On a remote stretch of the Pacific coast, hidden between cliffs eroded by centuries of wind and tide, there lies a beach that does not appear in tourist guides nor in catalogs of natural beauty. There are no nearby hotels, no signs, no paved paths leading to it. Those who know it, mostly fishermen and locals from the region, simply call it the Silent Shore. A name that evokes the particular absence of noise that characterizes it, as if the sea, upon reaching there, lost the will to roar. But what is truly extraordinary about that place is not the silence, nor the solitude, nor even the wild landscape surrounding it. It is the sand. A black sand, dense and compact, that during the day seems to absorb light like a liquid surface of obsidian, and on certain nights, under specific conditions, begins to emit its own subtle and vibrant glow, as if it breathed in the darkness. The phenomenon was first observed by a Costa Rican biologist named Alejandro Vargas, who was conducting an independent study on intertidal ecosystems in isolated areas. His initial report, written with scientific caution, spoke of a non-organic luminescent behavior in sedimentary granules of volcanic origin, which simply meant that the sand glowed for no apparent reason, and that the glow did not come from microorganisms like bioluminescent plankton, nor from particles reflecting moonlight. The glow was autonomous, and it had no identifiable source. During the first analyses, samples of the sand were collected at different times of the day. Under the microscope, the grains showed a common composition for volcanic beaches: high concentration of magnetite, dark olivine, and small traces of natural glass. But when these same samples were taken to the laboratory and kept in complete darkness, the phenomenon disappeared. It only occurred in the original environment. Even more puzzling, it only happened on moonless nights, when the sky was completely clear and the sea remained calm, as if the beach responded to a very precise environmental condition, and any disturbance, no matter how small, interrupted its behavior. Vargas decided to document one of those nights. He camped by the beach, set up a night vision camera, a portable spectrometer, and temperature and humidity sensors. At 2:17 a.m. it happened. Without warning, without change in the waves or breeze, the sand began to emit a faint, bluish glow that covered the ground like a luminous mist. It was not a uniform glow. It pulsated, with small variations that seemed to follow an internal rhythm, and when walking on it, the glow did not go out. It shifted, as if the pressure of the steps temporarily reorganized the energy the sand contained. The spectrometer recorded photon emission in a very low range of the visible spectrum, barely perceptible to the human eye. What caught Vargas's attention was that this emission did not respond to any type of thermal charge, friction, or known chemical reaction. It was as if the grains of sand released light stored within them, as if they had absorbed energy for centuries and, for some reason, chose those nights to release it. The samples, analyzed at the University of San Jose, revealed no radioactive elements nor common fluorescent minerals. But in one of the tests, when subjected to variable magnetic fields, the researchers noticed an unexpected change in the internal distribution of the grains. The particles seemed to briefly align, as if responding to a form of magnetic memory. This behavior, reminiscent of certain materials used in electronic devices, is completely unusual in natural sand. From that moment, the case escalated. Geologists, physicists, and materials experts began to take an interest in the beach. New expeditions were organized, some official, others under the umbrella of private institutions that did not offer many explanations. But all reached the same unsettling conclusion. What happened on that coastal strip could not be explained with current models. It was an isolated phenomenon, located with almost millimeter precision, that did not repeat on any nearby beach, not even those with similar geological composition. The strangest event occurred during one of the latest expeditions, when high-sensitivity thermographic cameras were used. In the middle of a particularly clear night, while the team recorded the pulsating glow, heat patterns appeared on the thermal image that did not correspond to the environment. They were thin, winding lines that appeared beneath the surface, forming a kind of underground network, as if something moved beneath the sand at a different temperature, drawing invisible circuits that the naked eye could not detect. But when they tried to dig to reach them, they found nothing. At barely 15 centimeters deep, the sand was ordinary. No traces, no tunnels, no anomalies. One hypothesis, marginal but fascinating, suggests that the beach might be settled over a buried structure. Not a lost city nor an ancient ruin, but something more elemental. A base. An artifact or a set of devices buried for centuries or millennia, interacting with the minerals in the sand under certain conditions, releasing stored energy through mechanisms we do not understand. Another, even more speculative theory proposes that the sand itself is the artifact, that the grains are not simple volcanic remains, but fragments of some degraded technological material, a kind of dust of non-earthly origin, or the product of a long-forgotten accident. The truth is that no one has managed to replicate the phenomenon in a laboratory. The sand, outside its environment, behaves like any other. It does not emit light, does not respond to stimuli, does not hold signals. It is only on that beach, under that absent moon, that it comes alive. And every time it does, it feels as though it is communicating something. A message without words, without form, but full of intention. As if what glows is not light, but memory. As if each grain of sand were remembering something, and its glow was just a whisper of what once happened beneath those waves. Those who have witnessed the scene in silence, without cameras or analysis, agree on a common perception, that when looking at that glow, one feels something is looking back, that it is not an inert spectacle, but a living manifestation, loaded with a meaning we do not understand. Some, after seeing it, never return. They say they have dreamed of that glow for weeks, that they hear a buzzing beneath their skin when approaching the coast, that the sand sticks to their clothes and does not want to leave. The beach remains there, nameless, unmarked, without tourists. Only the rumor of those who have stayed long enough to dare to speak of it. The black sand that shines does not appear on maps, nor in geology manuals, but it shines. And as long as it continues to do so, it will keep calling. Not with noise, not with promises, only with its light. A light that does not illuminate, but leaves marks. The shipwreck that had not yet been built. At the beginning of the year 2018, a submarine mapping mission funded by a European Oceanic Research Institute detected, off the coasts of the Central Atlantic, what appeared to be a common shipwreck. A metallic silhouette resting on the seabed, partially buried under a layer of recent sediments, with rectangular shapes, clear signs of internal compartments, and a front section notably well preserved. The coordinates were recorded, the images stored, and for weeks the finding generated little more than mild academic interest. Another shipwreck, they thought. Another relic of the countless vessels swallowed by the sea throughout history. The mystery began when they tried to identify the ship. The metallic structure, analyzed through sonar and volumetric scans, showed a modern internal configuration. Very modern. Its compartments followed a layout similar to contemporary designs of cutting-edge scientific ships. Spacious laboratory areas, internal technical cores, sections with shapes suggesting integration with advanced propulsion systems. Nothing matching a 20th century design, nor 19th. This was, without a doubt, a ship from the future. The naval engineers who studied the blueprints reconstructed by 3D software agreed on a key point. The materials composing the structure, according to remote spectrometry analyses, included an alloy that had not been used industrially until the year 2023. In other words, the ship found at the ocean floor had been sunk for at least 5 years, even though it had not yet been built. The first thing dismissed was technical error. All measurement instruments, date records, coordinates, and image interpretation algorithms were reviewed. Everything was correct. The scanner had captured, at a depth of more than 1,000 meters, the silhouette of a vessel that, from a physical point of view, was there and had been there for years. Even the marine sediments covering it, when analyzed, confirmed that the hull had been submerged for a long time. Not weeks, not months, years. And yet, there was no record of its existence. No naval registration, no serial number, no military or civilian database recognized that design as part of any known vessel. The ship simply did not appear. It had never been assigned, registered, or mentioned in international naval records. It was, in every possible way, a ship that did not exist, and at the same time, it was there. That was when one of the technicians on the team, naturally curious, used to searching for patterns where no one else did, decided to compare the found design with blueprints of future vessels under development. He accessed restricted databases containing naval projects still in the testing phase and stumbled upon something chilling. A prototype scientific vessel matching, at 96%, the structure found at the ocean floor. The only difference was that this prototype had not yet been built. It belonged to a German private company planning to begin assembly in the year 2024. The news, although initially treated cautiously, reached the ears of that company. What happened afterward was as fast as it was silent. The project leaders ordered the area closed, demanded exclusive access to the shipwreck images, and signed confidentiality agreements with the exploration team members. Officially, the matter was never discussed again, but some of the researchers, aware that this defied the most basic principles of time and causality, began to discreetly exchange information, trying to understand what kind of event they were witnessing. One of the most debated theories proposed the possibility of a temporal leak, a sort of overlap between timelines, where the ship, still non-existent in our present, had become trapped in a kind of loop between realities, as if its sinking was predestined to such a degree that the trace of its disaster had appeared before its construction. Another possibility, even more disturbing, suggested that the shipwreck was not the result of a future event, but its cause. That the discovery had forced the design of that ship, as if knowledge of its future existence obliged the fulfillment of an unavoidable destiny. Some researchers cited physical theories related to the structure of space-time in the presence of extreme gravitational fields. They spoke of dimensional folds, of regions on the planet where reality behaves non-linearly and where events can project backward in time as tangible echoes. Places where what will happen tomorrow can cast a shadow today, and that shadow in this case was a ship. The most unsettling element appeared weeks later, when a team managed to enter the vessel's interior using a small underwater drone. The interior was empty, as expected, but on one of the walls in the central compartment, a symbol was found painted with what seemed to be reflective paint, a logo. It was the same one that appeared in the German company's blueprints, a logo that, according to its own designers, had not yet been approved. It was a sketch that only existed in internal digital files. No one outside the development team had access to it. And yet, it was there, on the hull of a shipwreck, years before anyone had decided to build it. There was no official explanation. The area was closed off. The remains remain on the seabed, guarded by agreements between governments and corporations. But those who have followed the case in silence know that something broke with that discovery. Because it is no longer just about the sea and its secrets, nor about the impossible things emerging from the depths. It is about the timeline, about how something can leave a trace before it exists, about how a silent, forgotten shipwreck can defy the rules that uphold our idea of reality. And amid all that confusion, there is one unsettling certainty. That ship will be built. Because it has already been found. Because its sinking, at some deep level of time, has already occurred. And perhaps, just perhaps, we are beginning to understand that the sea not only holds the remains of the past, but also fragments of a future that has already begun to unravel. The skeleton without bones. Sometimes the sea returns things that defy language, because there are discoveries that cannot be described precisely, nor classified with scientific terms without seeming to lose something essential, something that lies right on the border between the biological and the inexplicable. That was exactly what happened in the summer of 2014, when a group of marine researchers found, 300 meters deep in the Manila Trench, what they would later call the skeleton without bones. It all began as part of a routine expedition to study abyssal life in areas of extreme pressure, organized by a consortium of Asian universities and funded by a private foundation seeking to better understand the physiology of invertebrate species. The mission used next-generation underwater drones, capable of moving with surgical precision through narrow marine canyons. One of these machines detected an elongated structure, half buried in the dark mud at the bottom, among calcareous formations. At first glance, the shape was unusual. A clearly organic silhouette, almost 6 meters long, with segments vaguely resembling a spine, but without the typical characteristics of bone tissue. Instead of bones, the structure was made of a translucent substance with a gelatinous appearance, yet surprisingly resistant. The drone's robotic arm tried to collect a small sample, but upon touching it, the segment reacted. It contracted briefly, as if it still retained some vitality. No one understood how this was possible. It seemed dead, and at the same time, it retained reflexes. The samples they managed to extract were immediately sent to 3 different laboratories, one in Tokyo, another in Sydney, and a third in Vancouver. All 3 agreed on one point. The substance did not correspond to any known animal tissue. It was not cartilage. It was not keratin. Nor was it a type of muscle. Its behavior was closer to that of a natural polymer with partial cellular regeneration capabilities. It had an ordered internal structure, as if designed to bear weight and distribute load, but without the need for ossification, as if it had evolved to fulfill the role of a skeleton, without becoming bone. The international scientific community was divided. Some argued that it was a new class of giant echinoderm, adapted to the extreme pressure of the depths and whose physiology defied the rules we knew. Others, more conservative, spoke of a soft fossilization phenomenon, structures that had begun to mineralize but stopped at an early stage due to unusual environmental conditions. However, this hypothesis did not explain why the tissue still reacted upon contact, nor why the distribution of its segments eerily resembled a vertebrate form. Norwegian biologist Håkon Mura, one of the first to examine the sample in the lab, wrote in his report a phrase that later became famous in specialized circles. "It has the shape of a skeleton, the symmetry of a vertebrate, and the consistency of a jellyfish. And yet, it is none of those things. It is as if someone had tried to build a body, from scratch, with different rules." As the weeks passed, new anomalies began to emerge. A second expedition returned to the Manila Trench to try to recover the rest of the body. But the structure was no longer there. The area showed signs of displacement, as if something large had dragged itself through the sediments. There were no currents strong enough to justify that movement. There was no nearby volcanic activity. And yet what remained of the skeleton without bones had disappeared, or had moved on its own. A third exploration was cancelled for unspecified logistical reasons. Some team members began to speak anonymously of possible military intervention in the area. Others claimed that an unusual acoustic signal had been recorded during the second expedition. A series of low-frequency pulses, separated by perfectly regular intervals, as if someone, or something, were emitting a calling pattern from the depths. That signal was never officially published. The original samples, meanwhile, began to behave strangely. Under laboratory conditions, kept at controlled temperatures and without light exposure, the fragments began to show internal reorganization, as if their cellular structure sought to rebuild itself. It was not regeneration in the classical sense, as occurs with certain living tissues. It was more like a slow, almost deliberate reconfiguration, an internal memory of the material that seemed to try to recover its original form, even outside the body to which it belonged. Faced with these observations, new questions arose. Was this being the remnant of a primitive life form that evolved under different principles? A biological anomaly, born of abyssal pressure that forces us to rethink what we understand as a spine? Or was it the result of something completely alien, a form assembled with an unknown purpose, as if someone had tried to imitate life without fully understanding how it works? One final theory, more philosophical than scientific, was proposed by an anthropologist specializing in oceanic mythology. After comparing the morphology of the finding with ancient engravings from Pacific Island cultures, he noticed disturbing similarities with certain figures described as sleeping guardians, or transition beings. Figures that, according to oral tradition, were neither alive nor dead, and waited in the depths for the world to offer them something they still did not know how to name. This may seem like a poetic interpretation, but in this case, it is hard to dismiss anything. To this day, no one has seen a similar structure again. The samples have been stored in sealed containers under constant observation. Some have begun to deteriorate. Others, inexplicably, have grown a few millimeters, as if they still breathed silently, because maybe that is what they were. Skeletons of something that did not need bones. Structures designed with a different logic, with a different urgency, with a different biology. One that perhaps does not even have an origin on Earth as we know it. And if that is true, then the most unsettling thing is not what we found. It is what will come next. Because if the sea shows us one part, it is because another part is approaching. Silent, complete, ready to emerge. The sculpture buried in the mud. It was during a routine dredging operation in the Niger Delta, an area where mud gathers like damp skin over the ocean's surface, that a fragment of something emerged which, at first glance, did not seem to belong to the seabed. The platform workers, used to pulling up dead coral remains, mangrove roots, and compact sediments, fell silent before the block of dark stone, angular, unusually heavy, and with a texture that did not match the environment. It was wrapped in a nearly gelatinous layer of silt that seemed to have sealed it for centuries. What was strange was not its shape, but what partially protruded from one of its sides. A carved figure, a hand, human, perfectly proportioned. and entirely out of place. At first, they thought it was an ancient African sculpture, perhaps part of a forgotten shrine or a ceremonial piece carried by the river from an inland settlement. But as they cleaned the mud from its surface, they began to uncover details that were impossible to ignore. The stone was not local. It had no visible natural veins, nor signs of wear from fresh water. Its surface had been polished artificially, as if shaped with precision tools. The hand, the one emerging from the stony mass, not only had the exact proportions of an adult human body, but displayed an anatomical level of detail beyond any artistic representation of the region. Palm lines, joints, even a broken fingernail that seemed deliberately carved. Local archaeologists were summoned. Then came experts in pre-colonial art, and finally, geologists. Each discipline offered part of the puzzle, but none could complete the whole. The stone had a composition similar to basalt, but with an unusual density. The way it reflected light at certain angles produced a faint metallic sheen, as if it contained particles of some unknown element. More unsettling still, there were no visible signs of erosion. It was as if it had been buried just yesterday. Yet carbon-14 analyses of the surrounding sediments dated it to at least 6,000 years ago. That was when the decision was made to excavate the extraction site. Beneath a layer of mud nearly 3 meters thick, something larger began to emerge. A buried structure of massive proportions. Not a simple sculpture, but a complete figure lying horizontally at the bottom of the channel. It measured over 9 meters from head to toe, although only a third of the body was uncovered. The rest remained hidden, as if the mud protected it, as if the sea somehow resisted giving it back. Its proportions were human but exaggerated, not grotesque, monumental. The torso displayed muscular details carved with near-surgical precision. Ribs, tendons, even the texture of the skin were rendered with unsettling fidelity. The head, however, was turned to one side, as if the being had fallen in that position, or had been placed there. Strangely, the face, although human in appearance, had features that seemed deliberately neutral. A blank expression, almost empty, as if it had been designed to represent something older than emotion. There were no inscriptions, no symbols, no decorative elements, nothing to indicate its purpose, origin, or creator. What they did find was a cavity in the chest, approximately the size of a human heart. A perfectly circular hollow, as if something had once been embedded there, but was now gone. A missing core. And that absence weighed more than anything else, because it turned everything into a question. Debates multiplied. Some archaeologists proposed that it was a ceremonial figure belonging to an undocumented civilization, perhaps an unknown proto-historic culture that had developed advanced sculpting techniques and was swallowed by the sea before leaving any trace. But the geologists found no evidence of human settlements in the region capable of crafting such a thing. And the iconography experts insisted there was no style anywhere in the Atlantic basin even remotely resembling this form of representation. What came next was even more unsettling. At night, a member of the excavation team, sleeping on the floating platform above the site, claimed to have heard a sound. Not a mechanical noise or the creak of shifting mud, but a deep vibration, a low frequency that was not recorded by any equipment, but was felt in his chest. Like a pulse, as if something beneath them was beating with an ancient rhythm. The next day, he found his boots covered by a thin layer of mud that had not been there the night before, and no one had stepped in that area. In the following days, the weather changed abruptly. Tides rose, currents grew violent, and the site was declared unsafe. The excavation had to stop. 3 days later, the figure was once again completely buried, as if the sea itself had decided to seal it back. Cameras installed to monitor the area recorded for hours how the mud, once passive, seemed to move with artificial fluidity, filling every gap, covering the body with a speed impossible to attribute to nature alone. Today, the place is marked on nautical charts as an unstable zone, inaccessible due to safety protocols. The figure, buried again, rests at the bottom. No one knows if it was a symbol, a warning, or an accident, but something in its design suggests intent. It was not sculpted at random. It had a hollow in the chest, a space, as if something had been taken from it, or as if it were still waiting to have it returned. And so it remains, nameless, unexplained, wrapped in mud, protected by the waters that concealed it for millennia. A sculpture without context, without a culture to claim it, without a history to support it, but alive in its presence, as if the mud breathed it, as if the ocean remembered it, as if whoever made it knew that one day someone would find it. Because there are creations not built to be seen, but to wait. And when they are disturbed, the world changes. Just a little. Just enough for silence to become suspicious. The sound of a distant roar. In the summer of 1997, while monitoring seismic activity on the ocean floor, scientists from the United States National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration captured a sound unlike anything ever recorded before. It was a roar, a deep guttural wail picked up by underwater microphones thousands of kilometers apart, in a range so low that humans could not hear it directly. They gave it a name that sounded like a scientific joke, the bloop. But no one laughed, because that roar, that echo that crossed the ocean as if launched from the throat of a colossal creature, was real. And to this day, it still has no definitive explanation. The sound was detected by a network of hydrophones originally designed to detect underwater nuclear tests during the Cold War. The devices, distributed at strategic points in the Pacific Ocean, recorded with astonishing clarity a constant vibration that rose in frequency for nearly a minute, as if something enormous were emerging from the darkest depths. But the most disturbing thing was not its form, but its volume. For a sound to travel in such a way, with such power, it had to have been produced by a living source of immense size, larger than any blue whale ever recorded. NOAA researchers, intrigued, began to trace its origin. The epicenter of the sound was located near a remote area southwest of South America, at the edge of a submerged oceanic ridge, a place with no known volcanic activity, no frequent passage of whales, and no industrial presence. The seafloor there is ancient and stable, a landscape of silence and darkness. And yet, that was the exact point where something, whatever it was, decided to be heard. Many explanations were proposed. Some pointed to icebergs fracturing under pressure, others to minor tectonic movements. But the sound's patterns did not match those phenomena. Nor was it human activity. The spectrogram of the roar bore the signature of a living being, a modulated, ascending, organic frequency, enough for comparisons to whale songs to become inevitable, but amplified to an almost mythological level. For weeks, the scientific community debated. Some insisted on finding a geological cause, something that would close the case without leaving room for speculation. But others began to ask more uncomfortable questions. What if there existed in the abyssal depths a life form we had never detected? A creature that had remained silent for centuries until, for some reason, it decided to roar. Was it a warning? A cry of pain? A form of communication? Comparisons to Lovecraft's work soon arose, especially since the sound came from a region near the exact point where the writer placed the sunken city of R'lyeh, home of the sleeping god Cthulhu. A literary detail that should carry no weight in a scientific investigation, if not for the fact that the parallel went viral. And where there is public attention, data begins to circulate through less official channels. Years later, in 2014, a team of independent researchers, led by Chilean oceanographer Gabriel Torres, claimed to have recorded a series of similar sounds, although much fainter, in an area not far from the bloop's epicenter. It was not a single roar, but a sequence, repeating patterns, as if someone, or something, was responding. But each of those echoes was weaker than the one before, as if the original source was moving away, or sinking deeper and deeper into the abyss. The team could not publish their findings in high-impact scientific journals. The recordings were fragmentary, and the capture method did not meet international standards. But the information spread, and those who know how to read between the lines began to take interest in the possibility that the sound was not an isolated event, but the audible fragment of a constant presence that had remained dormant, silent, in the depths of the ocean. And that is where things begin to take a darker turn. In 2018, during a drilling expedition to study the ocean floor, a commercial Chinese team withdrew from an area near the bloop's origin point after recording a series of unexplained seismic anomalies. In their internal reports, leaked a year later by a former worker, they described internal vibrations not attributable to tectonic movements, and, most unsettling, an inverted thermal sensation in the surrounding water. That is, the water at greater depths was warmer than the upper levels, as if heat were being released from below, as if something lived or moved down there. What became clear over the years is that the bloop was not a one-time phenomenon. It was a message, a trace, a heartbeat from something we do not understand. Because the deep ocean is not just a geographical frontier, it is also a sensory threshold. Everything that lives on the surface perceives it from afar, like a rumor, like an echo. But if a creature from those depths ever decided to surface, there would be no doubt. The sea would change. The air would change. We would change. And that is why, perhaps, that roar still resonates in the recordings like a dark beacon. A call that no one has answered, but that some have begun to hear in their own research. Because the ocean remembers, and from time to time, it allows itself to roar, to warn that it is still awake, and that what sleeps within it might not be just an animal. It might be a god. The city in the steam vent. It was during an international deep-sea exploration mission, led by a group of marine biologists and geologists, when the thermal sensors of an autonomous submarine detected a heat anomaly south of the mid-Atlantic ridge, in an area that, according to maps, should have been geologically inactive. The reading was clear. A concentrated heat point, located over 3,000 meters deep, appearing to emanate from a natural opening in the oceanic crust. Up to that point, everything could be explained. Hydrothermal vents, or black smokers, are well-known phenomena. They release superheated mineral-rich water, and entire ecosystems thrive around them, like islands of life in the darkness. But what the researchers found as they approached was not a simple hydrothermal vent. It was something that did not match any known natural formation. Beneath the dense layer of steam and sulfur, a symmetrical, orderly structure began to emerge, with straight lines that seemed deliberately arranged. Walls, columns, platforms, as if someone had built a city, a submerged metropolis, right on the edge of the ocean's thermal hell. The first images, captured by the Erebus drone, showed constructions carved into a type of rock that reflected light in an irregular way. Some structures appeared to have arches and passages. Others were completely buried under mineral deposits. This was no ordinary city. It was a set of structures organized around a heat source, and that arrangement suggested a purpose. The drone descended further, approaching the core of the steam, and it was then that the transmission began to flicker. For exactly 7 minutes, the images turned erratic. The signal cut out, returned, and showed fragmented glimpses of architecture that defied logic. In one frame, there was what appeared to be a staircase carved directly into molten rock, and in the next, a perfectly square room with reliefs on the walls. But what left the team in a state of shock was not the structures themselves, it was the symbols. Because in at least 3 of the images captured before contact was lost, inscriptions were recorded. They were not hieroglyphs, not Mayan glyphs, nor signs of any known language. They were complex geometric shapes, arranged in patterns repeated across various zones, as if they served a function or told a story we cannot yet read. When they recovered the drone, they found it covered by a layer of unusual crystallization. The material was not corrosive, but it was temperature reactive. A mineral mixture that, when cooled, formed a thin membrane, almost like skin. It was preserved for study, and one of the laboratories in Geneva identified a silicon compound combined with traces of lanthanides that do not form spontaneously under those pressure and heat conditions. Someone or something had altered the surrounding chemistry, and most disconcerting was that the crystallization did not cover the entire drone. It appeared to have been applied with precision, as if something down there had intended to protect it or mark it. Since then, the submerged city has been the subject of multiple secret expeditions, funded by institutions that rarely publish their findings. In one of them, a manned vehicle was used to directly observe the entrance to the vent's most active zone. And there, amid the steam and shadows, the crew swore they saw something move. Not fish, not known organisms, shaped shadows, gliding between the columns, as if patrolling the edges of what was once an inhabited place. In the absence of tangible proof, some began to speculate. What if it was not an abandoned city? What if it had never been uninhabited? What if those forms, those echoes amid the heat, were more than currents or optical illusions? Later studies revealed a pattern in the steam release. Every 6 hours, the pressure surged abruptly, expelling a dense cloud that dissipated within minutes. That regularity seemed more like a controlled response than a natural phenomenon, as if something was breathing below, as if the heat was a shield. Marine anthropologist Alexandre Dussault proposed a bold idea, that the city had been built by a biothermal civilization, a species adapted to life alongside extreme heat, capable of sculpting structures in molten rock, of arranging symbols not for decoration, but to control their surroundings. In his hypothesis, the city's inhabitants would not have been like us, not even like marine vertebrates. They would have been beings designed by geothermal energy itself. Entities that do not need light, that do not fear pressure, and that find in heat what we find in air, their natural medium. This theory has not been accepted by most of the scientific community, but it has deeply resonated in independent research circles. Because when reviewing the audio recordings made near the vent, constant frequencies were found that seemed to sound like pulses. It was not the sound of water, not bubbles, nor tectonic snaps. They were signals, repeated, almost musical. And the most unsettling part, one of those sequences matched a mathematical progression recorded in another region of the world, in a series of underwater petroglyphs found in the Sea of Japan. A statistically improbable coincidence. Access to the city has been restricted ever since. Officially for reasons of geological safety. Hydrothermal vents are unstable, and any disturbance could cause a local eruption. But those who have been close say there is another reason. That ever since the first explorations began, thermal readings have fluctuated strangely, as if something beneath were reacting, as if the city knew it had been seen. And that in itself changes everything. Because finding ruins is one thing. That is to be expected from the sea. What is unexpected is discovering a living structure. A city that breathes, that maintains its shape through heat, that carves symbols upon itself as a language, and that perhaps still has inhabitants. Now the vent remains there, in silence. Its steam rises, thick, every 6 hours. And the few who have observed it up close claim that within the fog, something looks back. Not with eyes, with presence, with intent, as if the city were waiting or judging. And as long as it does, it will remain a blind spot on official maps, a burning shadow in the middle of the ocean, a frontier where science hesitates and mystery advances, slowly but unstoppably, like a city that never stopped living, only hiding. The eel that counted backwards. For years, the migratory behavior of eels has been one of the most frustrating enigmas in marine biology. These creatures, so common in rivers and coastal waters, embark on impossible journeys to the center of the ocean to reproduce, guided by an impulse that science has yet to fully decipher. But there was one case, just one, that defied every known pattern. A specimen whose existence was recorded by mistake, but that changed the way a small group of researchers began to think about time, instinct, and something deeper, the memory of the sea. The discovery began in 2009 at a marine life monitoring station in the Danish Strait. There, a team using radio frequency tracking had placed transmitters on dozens of European eels, aiming to study their migration toward the Sargasso Sea. What they did not expect was to detect a signal that, instead of heading southwest, like all the others, was moving backwards. At first, they thought the transmitter had detached and was drifting with the currents. But when they examined the movement pattern, they realized it was too precise, too organic. It moved against the currents, descended into the depths, avoided obstacles. It had direction. It had intent. The eel, identified as E389, continued its reverse trajectory for weeks. While its kin vanished one by one into the vast immensity of the Atlantic, E389 moved northward, away from open sea, into colder, older waters. Its movement became erratic, but methodical. Each day it traveled nearly the same distance, but in reverse, as if undoing a path it already knew. The most unsettling moment came when the team discovered it was passing through the exact same points where it had previously been recorded, but in reverse order. The pattern was so precise that, when they overlaid the coordinates of its past and present routes, the maps matched almost perfectly. As if the eel was not migrating, but reliving its own life backwards. Each point was a familiar station, each depth an old stop. But there was no biological explanation for such behavior. Eels do not possess such detailed directional memory, much less one that works in reverse. This was not navigation. It was a kind of rewind. Then, more anomalies began to appear. The biologists analyzing the data noticed that E389's heart rate, measured by an implanted sensor, was decreasing over time, as if its metabolism were reversing. It was not a mere slowdown. Its biological functions seemed to be regressing. When cells were extracted during a brief recapture for routine analysis, they showed age markers younger than those originally recorded. The animal, according to reports, was rejuvenating. Against all logic, against all biology. During the third week of tracking, the eel dove more than 1,500 meters deep and remained motionless for 3 days. The data recorded during that period was strange. The signal was not lost, but vibrated with an irregular frequency, as if something were interfering. When it resurfaced, it resumed its reverse course, but it was no longer just regressing in distance. It was also regressing in behavior. It stopped feeding. It stopped emitting chemical mating signals. It behaved like a juvenile eel, even though its size was that of a fully developed adult. The scientific community was divided. Some suggested it was an unprecedented mutation, a genetic alteration that had reprogrammed its biological clock. Others began to speak of a quantum phenomenon, a localized distortion of cellular time triggered by oceanic electromagnetic fields. But none of those explanations accounted for the most chilling aspect. Each of the eel's actions matched an exact sequence of its past steps. It did not seem to be living. It seemed to be unliving, as if obeying a countdown that forced it to erase its tracks one by one. One final detail unsettled the researchers completely. When comparing E389's past routes with historical records of older migrations, they discovered that the eel's pattern matched one recorded in the 1960s, in a database that had not been digitized until then. A migration documented on paper, in a field notebook forgotten in a Danish library. E389's path was identical to that of an eel tagged in 1964. But it could not be the same animal. Eels do not live that long, unless it was not simply alive, unless it was repeating itself. From that moment on, a theory emerged, that E389 was not a unique eel, but an echo, a biological manifestation of a repeated cycle. As if in certain moments, the ocean emitted fragments of the past through creatures that should not exist. Or, even more disturbingly, as if some eels became trapped in a vital loop, repeating their lives over and over until they vanished, without purpose, without cause, just caught in a temporal tide that pushes them backward. The story ends in silence. One day, E389's signal disappeared. It happened right as it reached the area where it had first been captured, 2 years earlier. The transmitter was never recovered. No remains were found. The water remained calm. The only thing left was the trace of its entire journey, a life lived in reverse, an existence undone. As if upon reaching the point of origin, the creature simply ceased to be, or returned to the place it should never have left. The tracking file was archived as a closed case. Officially, it was classified as equipment failure and data misinterpretation. But those who were involved in the project know that what happened does not fit within traditional models. They know that the ocean, from time to time, releases small anomalies that force us to rethink reality. And this time, it did so through a creature so common that no one would have suspected anything. Because sometimes mysteries do not roar or shine. Sometimes they simply swim in the opposite direction, waiting for someone to notice, before disappearing. And maybe that is the real question. What else is swimming backwards in the deep? What other forms of life are unliving their time, returning step by step, not out of instinct, but out of something much older than the sea itself? Maybe we will never know. But if you ever see an eel swimming against the current, maybe it is not lost. Maybe it is going back. Maybe it is simply counting backwards. The others. Some testimonies are never recorded in official reports, never appear in databases, and are never mentioned at scientific conferences. They live on the margins, between personal journals, lost recordings, and statements given under conditions of anonymity. These are accounts that repeat with minimal variations, as if they share an invisible core, as if different people, in different parts of the world, had witnessed something impossible, and were searching for the words to describe it. That something, according to those who have spoken of it, goes by many names. The shadows, the ones who walk outside of time, the presences from the abyss. But there is one name that appears more frequently than one might expect. The others. The pattern always begins the same way. A sea expedition, whether scientific or for fishing, finds itself in open water, far from any coastline, where the signal is unstable and the sea is so dark that even artificial light seems to vanish instantly. And then, something happens. Not a loud phenomenon, but a subtle shift, almost imperceptible at first. A change in the density of the water, a deep silence that drowns even the sound of the engine, a mist that forms without explanation in the middle of the ocean. From that moment on, everything that happens leaves an indelible mark on those who experience it, even if they never speak of it aloud again. One of the most documented cases, inasmuch as one can speak of documentation, was that of the crew of the Kisaku Maru, a Japanese research vessel that disappeared in 1983 in the Philippine Sea. and was found 3 days later over 600 nautical miles off its intended course, with no signs of structural damage. The crew was intact, unharmed, but all refused to speak. One of the technicians on board, who later left the country and leaked a report to an independent journalist in Jakarta, claimed that in the early hours of the second day, the vessel had stopped for no reason, as if it had run aground on something invisible. At that moment, they began to see them. Humanoid figures emerging at close range from the vessel, not swimming, not floating, but simply appearing. They remained there, motionless, making no direct contact, yet giving the clear impression of watching. They had no distinct features. Their bodies were tall, slender, dark, and shimmered with a faint blue phosphorescence. None of them made any sound. And yet, those who saw them claimed to feel a voice inside their heads. A single voice, shared. It did not speak. It showed images, sequences, fragments of past events the witnesses could not explain, like memories that did not belong to them. Wars under the water, beings constructing impossible structures, stars reflected on the ocean floor as if the sky were beneath them. The next day, the ship began moving on its own, without engine power. The crew lost consciousness for several hours, and when they awoke, they were back on course, but with the sensation that they had lost more than time. One of the sailors took his own life weeks later. In his note, he left a chilling phrase: "They were already here before us, and they will remain after." What is unsettling is that the Kisaku Maru case was not isolated. Over the decades, dozens of similar reports have been collected in fragmented ways by organizations like the Ocean Anomaly Record Coalition, an informal network of researchers compiling inexplicable patterns. Since 1971, they have identified at least 84 incidents in which witnesses claim to have seen entities in open waters, always far from shore, in areas of extreme depth, and almost always near magnetic anomalies or submerged tectonic faults. Descriptions vary in detail, but they all agree on the essentials: humanoid presences with no features, silent, observing. They never attack. They never interfere. They only appear and then vanish, as if their purpose was not to be seen, but to remind those who see them that something else inhabits the ocean, something that does not need to communicate to assert its presence, something that may be tied to the very origin of the sea itself. In 2005, an underwater monitoring station in the Scotia Sea recorded a sequence of sonic pulses in an unusual mathematical pattern. Acoustic experts dismissed it as a tectonic phenomenon, until an amateur cryptologist cross-referenced the data with the hunting pulses of certain cephalopods. The resemblance was so precise that some began to propose an unusual theory. What if the others are not beings as we imagine them, but a form of collective consciousness expanded through the ocean, using sound as language, water as channel, and human perception as a window of access? From that point on, the interpretation shifted. The others were no longer seen as physical presences, but began to be understood as manifestations, echoes of something deeper, older than humanity itself. An oceanic intelligence that allows us to glimpse it through fragments, for seconds, before vanishing. Some have even begun to wonder if these figures are nothing more than reflections of ourselves, projected from another dimension, returned by the sea as a warning, as rehearsal, as shadow. To this day, there is not a single reliable photograph, nor a verifiable recording of these appearances. But the stories continue to multiply. Scientists with impeccable careers, sailors with decades at sea, professional divers, all recounting the same sensation, that of being watched by something that is there, at the edge of the threshold, waiting. And though each testimony is shared with caution, with fear of discredit, They all include a final detail that cannot be ignored. After each encounter, something changes. In the body, in the mind, in the perception of time. As if looking at the others activates something dormant. As if carrying that memory in one's blood were a key or a seal. Because perhaps the others do not come from beyond the ocean. Perhaps they do not swim in from distant galaxies. Perhaps they have always been here. In the deepest cracks. In the shadows that brush the heels of those who dive too far. In the murmur that hides among the waves when everything seems calm. Waiting. And maybe that is the real mystery, that they were never visitors, but hosts, and we, the ones who came after. If anything you heard today made you think the ocean hides more than we believe, then this channel is your place. Subscribe, share this video, and comment which of these mysteries gave you goosebumps or made you look into the deep more cautiously. We are not here to explain the inexplicable, but to face it together, to let awe pull us like an untamable current. Thank you for being on the other side. And remember, where knowledge ends, mystery begins. Good night.